Here is a fact that should make every executive in America lose sleep. The Ford Motor Company spent a decade planning a car. They surveyed thousands of consumers. They hired the best designers in Detroit. They consulted psychologists, sociologists, and motivational researchers who claimed to understand not just what Americans said they wanted in an automobile, but what they secretly desired, what unconscious needs a car could fulfill, what aspirations could be welded to a fender and sold back to the buyer as identity. They built an entire division from scratch, with its own factories, its own management, its own dealer network of over 1,100 showrooms across the country. They invested $250 million in development alone, a figure so large in 1957 that it represented one of the biggest product bets in the history of American capitalism. They did everything right. Every study confirmed the market existed. Every analysis supported the business case. Every executive involved believed they were building a car that would close the gap between Ford and General Motors and redefine what a mid-priced American automobile could be. And then they launched it, and the American public looked at it, drove it, read about it, and said no. Not no in a whisper. No in a way that turned the car's name into a synonym for failure that has survived for nearly 7 decades. The car was called the Edsel. It lasted 26 months. It sold 116,000 units against a target of 200,000 per year. It cost the Ford Motor Company $350 million, roughly $3.6 billion in today's money. And the reasons it failed are more instructive, more painful, and more relevant to how decisions are made in boardrooms today than anyone at Ford ever wanted to admit. The seed was planted in 1948. Henry Ford II, the grandson of the founder, had taken control of a company that was hemorrhaging money and had nearly collapsed during the war years under the erratic management of the aging Henry Ford Sr. The younger Ford brought in a group of former Army Air Force statistical analysts, 10 men who became known as the Whiz Kids, to modernize the company's accounting, production, and planning. Among them were Robert McNamara, who would later become Secretary of Defense under Kennedy, and Arlen Miller, Charles Thornton, and others who would reshape the way Ford made decisions. These men believed in data. They believed in systems. They believed that the messy, intuitive, gut-feel approach to building cars that had defined Detroit could be replaced by rigorous market analysis and rational planning. They were brilliant. They were also about to produce the most expensive failure that rational planning had ever created. The problem they identified was real. General Motors dominated the American car market through a strategy that a GM executive had articulated decades earlier. The idea was simple. You offered a car for every purse and purpose. At the bottom was Chevrolet, cheap and cheerful. Then Pontiac. Then Oldsmobile. Then Buick. Then at the top, Cadillac. As an American family prospered, they climbed the GM ladder, trading up every few years to the next brand. Each step felt like progress. Each step kept the customer inside the General Motors family. Chrysler had a similar ladder. Plymouth at the bottom, then Dodge, then DeSoto, then Chrysler, then Imperial. Ford had a problem. At the bottom was Ford. At the top was Lincoln. In between, there was only Mercury, and Mercury was not enough. There was a gap. When a Ford owner got a raise and wanted something nicer, there was nothing for him between Mercury and Lincoln. He walked across the street to an Oldsmobile dealer or a Buick showroom, and he was gone. Ford was losing customers at the exact moment those customers were ready to spend more money. The data confirmed it. Studies showed that in the mid-1950s, Pontiac, Buick, and Dodge were selling a combined 2 million cars a year in the medium price range. Ford had almost no presence in that segment. The opportunity was obvious. The solution was obvious. Build a car to fill the gap. In April 1955, the Ford Board of Directors approved the plan. A new division was created. Not as a new car. A new division. Its own president, its own designers, its own manufacturing, its own marketing, its own dealer network. This was the first critical mistake, though nobody recognized it at the time. Creating a separate division meant enormous fixed costs before a single car was sold. Salaries, offices, tooling, dealer development, advertising, all of it had to be funded in advance against future sales that were projected, not guaranteed. The division needed to sell 200,000 cars a year just to break even. That was the number. Below it, the entire enterprise lost money. Above it, Ford would close the gap on GM. There was no middle ground. The car was known internally as the E-car. E for experimental. Finding a real name consumed an almost comical amount of corporate energy. Ford's advertising agency, Foote, Cone, and Belding, ran an internal contest that produced over 6,000 name suggestions. The marketing research department polled consumers in New York, Chicago, and 2 small towns in Michigan. They tested names for associations. Some are promising. Citation, Corsair, Pacer, Ranger. These would all eventually be used as model names within the line. But the division itself needed a name that, as one executive put it, would flash a dramatically desirable picture in people's minds. In desperation, the head of marketing research contacted the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet Marianne Moore and asked for her help. Moore, who is also a passionate baseball fan and boxing enthusiast, threw herself into the assignment with the enthusiasm of a woman who had no understanding of the automobile business whatsoever. Over a series of letters, she submitted names including Resilient Bullet, Utopian Turtletop, Mongoose Civique, Pastelogram, Intelligent Whale, and Andante con Moto. None were adopted. At a meeting of the Ford Executive Committee in November 1956, the chairman, Ernest Breech, had finally had enough. "Why don't we just call it Edsel?" he said, and they did. Edsel Ford had been Henry Ford's only son. He had been president of the company from 1919 until his death from stomach cancer in 1943. He was by most accounts a thoughtful, cultured, design-conscious man who had been ground down by decades of conflict with his domineering father. Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, had explicitly opposed naming the car after his father. He did not want his father's good name spinning around on thousands of hubcaps, as one executive later recalled. But Henry Ford II was not present at the meeting where the decision was made. When a name was tested with consumers, it evoked associations with pretzel, weasel, and diesel. The public relations director for the new division, C. Gail Warnock, typed a terse memo after learning the result. "We have just lost 200,000 sales." They built the car anyway. And in fairness, the car they built was not terrible. The 1958 Edsel came in 4 series, the Citation and Corsair on Mercury platforms, the Pacer and Ranger on Ford platforms, plus 3 station wagons. It offered features that were genuinely innovative for the price range. A rotating dome speedometer borrowed from aircraft instrumentation. Warning lights for low oil, overheating, and engaged parking brake. Self-adjusting brakes. A push-button teletouch transmission with the selector mounted in the center of the steering wheel hub, where the horn button usually sat. The biggest available engine, a 410 cubic inch V8, produced 345 horsepower. There were 90 possible color combinations. This was not a cynical product. Real engineers had worked on real problems and produced real solutions. But the front end. The front end was where it all went wrong visually. The Edsel's signature design element was a vertical oval grille set into the center of the front fascia, surrounded by horizontal chrome. It was supposed to be distinctive. It was supposed to be the element that made an Edsel instantly recognizable from a block away, the way you could identify a Cadillac or a Buick at a glance. Instead, it became an object of immediate and merciless ridicule. Time magazine said it looked like a horse collar. Others said it resembled a toilet seat viewed from above. Still others reached for anatomical comparisons that cannot be repeated in polite company, but that spread through the culture with the speed of a joke that everyone wants to tell. The grille was a disaster not because it was ugly in isolation, but because it was strange in a market where consumers wanted reassurance, not provocation. In 1957, Chrysler's designer Virgil Exner had launched the Forward Look, a fleet of long, low, finned automobiles that were the envy of the industry. GM was racing to catch up. Every other car on the road was moving toward horizontal, sleek, jet-age styling. The Edsel's vertical mouth was moving in the opposite direction, and it arrived on dealer lots looking like the one face in the crowd that did not understand what year it was. September 4th, 1957. E-Day, the biggest new car launch in automotive history. Ford had spent $12 million on advertising alone, an enormous sum that exceeded the entire annual advertising budget of most American corporations. Teaser campaigns had run for months, revealing the car's features piece by piece while keeping its appearance concealed behind silhouettes and careful camera angles. Ads promised an entirely new kind of car. New Edsels were shipped to dealers sealed under wraps, and dealers were instructed not to unwrap them until E-Day. The secrecy was deliberate and borrowed from the playbook of military operations. Nobody outside Ford was supposed to see the car before the nation saw it all at once. The company sponsored a television special called The Edsel Show, hosted by Bing Crosby, featuring Frank Sinatra, Louis Armstrong, and Bob Hope. 60 million Americans watched. The anticipation was extraordinary. One journalist later wrote that the public had been teased into expecting a plutonium-powered, pancake-making supercar. What they got was a Mercury with a strange grille and push buttons where the horn should have been. And then the economy collapsed. The United States entered a recession in the fall of 1957, weeks after the Edsel's launch. It was not a mild slowdown. Car sales across the industry fell 31% in a single year, from nearly 8 million units in 1955 to 4.3 million in 1958. The mid-price segment, the exact market the Edsel was designed to capture, was hit hardest. Budget-conscious consumers traded down to cheap Fords and Chevrolets or bought fuel-efficient imports like the Volkswagen Beetle, which was selling over 100,000 units a year by 1960. The entire theory that had justified the Edsel's existence, that Americans would keep spending more on flashier, bigger cars forever, evaporated in a single fiscal quarter. The medium-priced brands that had looked so prosperous in 1955 began to die. Packard was already gone. DeSoto would follow within 2 years. Hudson and Nash had merged into American Motors and were fading from dealer lots. Studebaker was circling the drain. The Edsel had been conceived during the greatest consumer boom in American history and born into a bust that killed 5 established brands. The timing was catastrophic, and it was the one variable that no amount of market research could have predicted because the researchers had assumed the boom would continue. They had extrapolated from the present into the future, and the future had not cooperated. But timing was not the only problem. The cars themselves had quality issues that were devastating for a brand with no existing customer loyalty. Edsels were built on Ford and Mercury assembly lines alongside those brands' regular products. The Edsel bodies were different enough to require special tooling and procedures, but not different enough to justify a dedicated production line. Workers building Fords all day would suddenly have to build an Edsel with different trim, different components, different assembly sequences, and then go back to building Fords. The result was predictable. Cars arrived at dealers with trunks that leaked. Wiring was routed too close to exhaust manifolds. Welds were unfinished. Paint was inconsistent. The push-button teletouch transmission, mounted where drivers instinctively reached for the horn, caused accidental gear shifts. Some cars were shipped to dealers incomplete, with parts missing or improperly installed. The first impression that thousands of buyers had of their brand-new Edsel was a trip back to the dealer for warranty work on a car that had been driven less than 100 miles. More than half of the 63,000 first-year Edsels were sold in the first 4 months. After that, the word was out. Sales collapsed. In January 1958, Ford folded the Edsel division into the Lincoln and Mercury division. The grand vision of a standalone brand with its own identity was dead in 4 months. The 1959 models were stripped down, the distinctive grille softened, the model count reduced from 18 to 10. Robert McNamara, who had opposed the Edsel program from the beginning and was now president of Ford Motor Company, oversaw the slow death with the detached efficiency of a man who had always preferred small, profitable cars to big, speculative gambles. McNamara was a numbers man. He had been one of the original WizKids. He believed in data, in cost control, in building what the spreadsheets said people would buy. The Edsel had been the creation of the opposite instinct, the instinct that said you could create desire, that you could build a brand from nothing through sheer force of marketing and willpower. McNamara's ascent and the Edsel's descent were mirror images of the same organizational reckoning. The dreamers had spent $350 million. The accountant was now in charge. On November 19, 1959, Ford announced the end of the Edsel program. Fewer than 2,846 model year 1960 Edsels had been built. Used Edsel values plummeted by $400 overnight. Dealers scrambled to cancel advertising contracts. The name Edsel entered the American vocabulary as a word meaning something that looked good on paper and failed in reality. McNamara would leave Ford shortly afterward to become Secretary of Defense under John F. Kennedy, where he would apply the same data-driven confidence to the Vietnam War with results that make the Edsel look like a minor miscalculation. The total damage was $350 million. Ford's net income per share dropped from $5.40 in 1957 to $2.12 in 1958. The dividend was cut. The stock price fell from above $60 to below $40. It was, at the time, the most expensive product failure in the history of American business. The lessons of the Edsel have been taught in business schools for 7 decades, and they're always the same lessons because they are always being ignored. The market research was backward-looking. Ford studied what consumers had wanted in 1955 and built a car for delivery in 1958. 3 years is an eternity in consumer taste. The hype exceeded the product. When you spend millions telling people they are about to see the future and then show them a Mercury with a vertical grille, the gap between expectation and reality is not just disappointing. It is insulting. The consumers feel tricked, and tricked consumers do not write polite letters. They tell their friends. Quality was sacrificed for schedule. Ford was so committed to the September 1957 launch date that cars were shipped before they were ready, and the resulting warranty claims destroyed the brand's reputation before it had a chance to build one. The organizational structure was wrong. A separate division with separate fixed costs meant that anything less than runaway success was financial catastrophe. And the name tested badly. The people in the room knew the name tested badly. They used it anyway because the chairman was tired of arguing about names. That moment, that instant when fatigue overruled data, cost the Ford Motor Company $350 million. There is one more irony buried in the wreckage. The Edsel division had been developing a compact car for the 1960 model year, a small, sensible vehicle called the Edsel Comet. When the division was killed, the Comet was transferred to Mercury and sold without the Edsel badge. It was a success. Meanwhile, Ford itself launched the Falcon, a compact car that became one of the best-selling vehicles in America. The market that Ford had spent a decade and $350 million trying to enter from above, the medium price segment, had disappeared. The market that actually existed in 1960 was below, in small cars, in economy, in the exact opposite of everything the Edsel represented. Ford found that market, but not because of the Edsel. In spite of it, the Edsel is remembered as a joke, a punchline about corporate arrogance and ugly grills. But it was not a joke to the 1,100 dealers who invested their savings in Edsel showrooms and lost everything. It was not a joke to the engineers who spent years on a product they believed in. It was not a joke to the workers who built the cars and watched them come back with complaints. And it was not a joke to Edsel Ford's 3 sons, who had objected from the beginning to their father's name being placed on a car, and who were then forced to watch that name become the most famous failure in American industrial history. Edsel Ford had been a man of taste and vision who had championed the Lincoln Zephyr and the Continental, 2 of the most beautiful cars Ford ever built. He had transformed Ford's wartime factories and pushed the company toward modern design against his father's stubborn resistance. He had died at 49 from the stress of working for a father who undercut him at every turn. And his reward, 15 years after his death, was to have his name welded to the biggest commercial disaster of the 20th century. Today, surviving Edsels are collector's items. The rarest, the 1960 Ranger convertible, had only 76 units produced. Enthusiasts gather at shows and swap meets and talk about the car with an affection that would have bewildered the executives who killed it. The irony is that the Edsel was not a bad car. It was a reasonable car with some innovative features that was launched at the wrong time, with the wrong name, into the wrong market, with insufficient quality control, after a marketing campaign that promised the moon and delivered a sedan. The Edsel even became a weapon in presidential politics. In the 1964 campaign, Barry Goldwater attacked Robert McNamara, then serving as Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, by pointing to the Edsel as evidence of McNamara's judgment. The man who gave us the Edsel, Goldwater said, now wants to tell us how to run the Pentagon. It was an unfair attack. McNamara had opposed the Edsel, but fairness has never been a requirement in American politics, and the Edsel's name had become so synonymous with failure that merely associating someone with it was considered a devastating insult. A car that had been dead for 5 years was still potent enough to be used as a political weapon. Every one of the failures that killed the Edsel was a decision made by a human being in a room, and every one of those human beings had data supporting their decision at the time they made it. The research said build it. The consultants said name it. The designers said the grille was distinctive. The production team said the launch date was achievable. The economists said the boom would continue. None of them were lying. None of them were incompetent. They were reading a map of a country that no longer existed by the time they arrived. That is the real lesson of the Edsel, and it is a lesson that American industry learns and forgets and learns again every generation. Ford itself recently wrote off $19.5 billion in losses on its electric vehicle program, a bet that looked inevitable during the EV boom and now looks uncertain in a changed market. The data was not wrong. The world changed, and hundreds of millions of dollars, or billions, vanish into the gap between the world the data described and the world that actually showed up when the cars rolled off the line. The Edsel is not a story about a car. It is a story about the distance between a plan and reality. And that distance, measured in dollars, is $350 million. Measured in human terms, it is the distance between confidence and humility, between what we think we know and what we actually know, which is less than we will ever be comfortable admitting.